Welcome back, everybody, to the Team Coaching Zone. And here we are on our Friday Team Coaching Learning Conversation series. And back in the zone, we've got Melissa Sayer. Melissa, good to see you.
Yeah, delighted to be here.
Yep, and I see
Good
you're
conversation with
bright
David.
and pink today, which is good. We need
Yes,
some extra energy and on a Friday, but I think there's
I'm
other
planning
reasons.
on wearing pink for the month of March on our podcasts, Krista, given that it's International Women's Week next week. So
okay, all right.
Plan. Yes.
All
Perfect.
Right. Well, happy to support that. And as always, great to be back in the zone with David Tate, Dr. David Tate as well, one of the early OG interview guests back in 2015 on this show. David, great to have you back.
Krista, thanks so much for having me back. It's great to be back in the zone with you and with Melissa today.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, we've got Melissa holding it down in Dublin. We've got David. I think you're in Yale and at New Haven in Connecticut.
That's right.
And I am in Southampton in New Jersey in the United States. So going to be the three of us today. And, folks will be listening in on YouTube and LinkedIn now. It's live streaming, but also making this available on all the platform channels after the show. But anyways, David, it's been a long time since we had you on the show, but back 7-8 years ago, we were talking a lot about some of your work with family systems, therapy and work in organizations, and in particular with family-owned businesses. And, I know it's been, 8 years, but I'm curious, that's where we were back then. You and I have been able to collaborate on a couple of great projects. Maybe some of that storytelling will come up today, but
sure.
You want to give the listeners just a little bit of the elevator pitch to who you are, what you've been up to, maybe, in a minute or two of the last 8 years, if you can kind of sum it up, to the essence. It's just a coaching skill of bottom lining, right? As just getting to the essence of things. So.
That's right. So I guess a couple of things have changed, Krista, since then. One of the things is that I've been affiliated with Yale since I came here in 1998 to complete my training. But in 2016, I began teaching at the School of Management. And so I've been involved there in a number of capacities. I'm teaching courses in the graduate programs, MBA, and other master's programs on interpersonal and group dynamics, as well as global leadership. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because it's really group and teams-based learning in an experiential way. So that work has been really exciting. Also doing a lot of work in executive education programs at Yale. And I've also been working with a group called the Yale World Fellows Program, which brings mid-career professionals from all over the globe to Yale for a semester. And they mentor students and give talks, and they can take whatever classes they want at Yale. And they provide in real enrichment for the university. And for each other, they gain, their perspectives get elevated by being in this cohort of folks. About 3,000 people or more apply for the 16 spots. So it's probably one of the most competitive programs at Yale, and it attracts really just incredible change makers. So that's working with that program has been also a real thing I've been excited about. And then on the consulting side, our practice has evolved. Beyond family businesses, we're doing a lot of work coaching with executives, teams, and working with companies around culture and how can they think more consciously about the culture that they're creating. So it provides tailwinds instead of headwinds towards their goals. And then we also me and some colleagues wrote a book that came out in 2022 called Conscious Accountability. And so a lot of our work has been also around that. So that's, I guess, in a nutshell, some of the things that have been going on this side in the last bunch of years since I've been in the zone here.
That's awesome. Well, a lot of rich stuff. And I know, Melissa, you are also moonlighting a bit as a professor in university and working with MBA students, I think. So something maybe you and David have in common is
MBAs, executive education, around the same space, leadership and grand challenges, and around team effectiveness and team dynamics. So I'd love to dive into that some more, but I guess if we maybe started with the book that you were working on over the pandemic with your colleagues, which I'm sure turns up in the classroom as well in terms of some of the programs that you're teaching. And I'm kind of intrigued about, you know, the whole coming together as a team and the lived experience of holding each other accountable to write that book in a quite intentional way. And then about insights from the book itself. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the genesis of that project, how it emerged, how it folded, and of course the kind of main highlights from the book itself?
Sure, be happy to share some on that. So the project, the beginning of it was I was asked to develop some material around accountability for an executive education program, and so as I was doing that research, I was struck by how, to me, some of the existing material on accountability really didn't take into account what makes us human and what really deeply motivates us, and so some of the material felt sterile. So I really thought about accountability and tried to come up with a different way that that was, perhaps a practical roadmap to help people create accountability in their relationships, in their teamwork, and one that is more compassionate towards the fact that mistakes happen, and rather than have a blame orientation towards accountability, let's have a learning orientation towards accountability. So I developed that material for executive education, and it was very well received. And the client, ATD, Association for Talent Development, happens to have a publishing arm, and they said, we've been looking to do a book on accountability for a number of years. Would you be interested? And I hadn't really planned to write this book, but the opportunity kind of just dropped in my lap, and I thought, great, let's do it. So for me, I know I'm more accountable if I have other people to be accountable to. And so I invited my colleagues, Marianne Pantalone and Darren David, to join that project with me. And so so together we kind of took it on, and as you know, we wrote through pandemic, which was of course a challenging time in many ways. And it was a time during which we saw the world changing, before our eyes, and sort of again thinking about how do we do accountability under these changing conditions in this different world that's emerging. Kind of informed some of our thinking through the process.
Well, I guess it gave an amazing lens of the need for compassion, as we lived through that pandemic, as you were kind of generating your ideas. Can you say a little bit more about what areas you drew from? Because I was intrigued by this whole idea of accountability 1.0, and then kind of moving on to the accountability that we need for today's world.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Sure. I think in terms from a theoretical standpoint, some of the things we drew on were kind of what really deeply motivates us. And so we looked at self-determination theory, which identifies three basic fundamental human needs that when we kind of tap into, we can pull the best out of people because it's coming from the things that genuinely kind of motivate and connect us. So one is, the need for autonomy and freedom. The other is the need for relatedness and connection. And the third is the need for mastery and, being able to grow and learn. So I think that self-determination theory embeds itself in our framework as we think about how do we be more aware of ourselves, first of all, and aware of others and what their needs, values, motivations are in our work with them. And again, the idea is when we can be more conscious, when we can bring that kind of greater level of awareness, whether it's of ourselves, of others, or even sort of systemic level awareness, we can be much more responsible for our impact on other people. Whether that's our actions, greater awareness that our actions and inactions have impact, whether we're aware of it or not, on on a group, groups and different groups of stakeholders to whom that we are connected by these invisible threads that sometimes we're not always paying attention to.
Yeah. And I guess you share some really nice kind of, I don't know if they're vignettes or stories of leaders that you've worked with and the impact that these leaders have on their teams when, they lack accountability or lack the awareness of how they're showing up on those teams. Are they drawn from all of your practice, or are they kind of, I was particularly liked the one where the leader decided not to turn up for the retreat and everything that came with that.
Yeah. No, these were drawn. We basically, we created based on our real lived experience in working with leaders in teams and organizations. The examples were drawn from our collective experience. We, didn't. Sometimes we change the details or actually combined different situations to create a story for the book, but they're basically things that were that we witnessed and experienced,
recognized that happen in workplaces on a fairly frequent basis. Krista, do you have any stories to share about teams where you've been working with around trying to coach accountability? Or
well, actually, what was going through my mind is I have actually been on teams with both of you and am on teams with both of you. And I have to say, and this isn't just for flattery purposes, but when I think of actually people who really embody accountability, I think both of you really do that really well on the teams that I've been on. And it's something I've come to respect and appreciate about you both, is just holding the line on things, making sure we follow through on commitments we said we were going to. And usually it kind of comes when there's pressure or competing commitments, or it's kind of easy just to say, oh, let's just skip that. I think you guys are really good at making us hold the line and, doing it in a way that doesn't make a person feel guilty or ashamed, but nonetheless, holds a space. And I think what it does is it, fosters trust for me in you or in the team. I think it instills a level of confidence and professionalism. I think that's something it really brings a lot. I notice when I'm working with the both of you. But, in terms of coaching, which I think is interesting, if you think at the core, coaching is really about setting goals, providing support and challenge, and accountability. And so it is really, I think, a core fundamental behavior of coaching. And so I tend to be, on the task relationship side of things, I tend to lean a bit more towards task just in terms of my nature. So my skills around, of course, I'm relational as well, but not as much as I am task oriented. So I tend to default to things like Kanban or visual management, getting into cadences. So I like structural interventions to help foster accountability. And I notice you, Melissa, and I don't know if this is true for you too, David, or not, but I think, Melissa, you tend to hold a little bit more the relationship side of the accountability. And I think that's something I saw in your book, David, was about the task side as well as the relationship side of the accountability equation. But so I think that's when I work with teams, I tend to default a little bit more to the structures. But I do think there is something about the risk-taking and conversations, right, which leads to safety, psychological safety and all that. But also it's important to verbalize and give voice to these things, because, I think organizations do tend to default to task before relationship or way over relationship. So a lot of stuff gets just swept under the rug, not discussed. And that really doesn't serve anybody well, especially when the pressure kind of cooker is building up over time.
Yeah, to that point, Krista, I mean, some of the teams that I've worked with, if they haven't sufficiently established psychological safety to talk about the places where people's feelings got hurt, or where people felt stepped on or stepped over, or if they just don't feel like it's a safe environment where they can really push back, disagree, share, questions that kind of poke at, ideas that are being forwarded, or solutions that teams don't end up getting to. First, they get sort of log jammed. Their process gets stymied, and a lot of things, people then begin trying to work around each other, and it gets in the way of the team actually functioning in an interdependent way. And so that's one of the practices that we talk about in our Connect framework. The Connect framework is 7 practices that people can use every day to promote better accountability. And one of those practices we call opening up engagement, which is really about fostering both commitment to the work and psychological safety. So, and I think there's a lot leaders can do to create the conditions where people feel more willing to speak into what's true for them. So, and that makes a big difference in keeping teams moving and not having them get sort of stalled or stuck.
Yeah. David, there was a question that popped up here around whether the book is really more about holding others accountable or ourselves accountable, because these are 2 different things. My sense is it's probably both, and I think you did comment on that in the book, but perhaps you'd want to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, it really is about both. I think the framework that we utilize can be equally applied to oneself as to working with others. I mean, it is a bit of a more of an interpersonal model in a way, but I think a lot of the things, a lot of the practices also apply to holding oneself accountable. So, and so, yeah, I do. And the other thing is, of course, it's not just for accountability at work. It's really about accountability in any relationship. And, we sort of are of the mind that there's an accountability equation in every single relationship that we have, whether it's spoken or unspoken. We need and expect things from one another, and therefore there's the need to be accountable to those things in the relationships we have. And so, the model, I think, applies to all sorts of relationships. Yeah.
I'm curious there, as you said that, around our ability to reset accountability in the relationships that we have. So some of the practices that you're talking about are very much to, I guess, do that to help leaders examine how they're holding themselves and others accountability, or to kind of do a reset in a team. But we kind of tend to struggle with that a little bit, don't we? Or others try and push back on us and go, well, no, that's not normally the role that you play in this dynamic. Could you say a little bit more about that, David?
Yeah. So, I do think that, first of all, that I think accountability is something that lots of both people and organizations struggle with. It's actually one of the things I hear a lot, when I'm, giving, talks with executives and hearing their stories about accountability. Sometimes I'm disappointed because the people that I'm working with haven't really delivered. But then when I look more closely, it may be because I actually wasn't as clear as I should have been about my expectations, that I didn't actually, really dial down what my expectations were. And then I get disappointed when I didn't get what I was hoping for. So this is, we think about accountability, especially with others, as always a shared endeavor. And so everybody involved is participating in some way in that dynamic. And that, as far as a reset goes, I think, there's always the opportunity to kind of pause and examine how this is going, and where the opportunities for us to up level and improve. And, that can, and one of the practices that, the last practice in the model is trying again. So the idea here is that we take everything that we've learned by in our experience working with other people, whether it's the at the end of whatever cycles that you want to look at. It could be a quarter, it could be the end of a project or a program. It could be, like at the next meeting. And let's look back, figure out what worked, what didn't work so well, what do we think would support us better, and pull those learnings forward into kind of the next opportunity. So I do think that it is that this idea of reset is absolutely relevant. And I mean, again, the way we think about this is that the practice of accountability is ongoing. It's not like you get it right, you check the box and you're done. No, this is like something we are working on every day, and we will work on for the rest of our lives, because it's dynamic, not static.
Yeah.
A case story is coming up for me. A couple of years ago, Ruth Wagaman and I were working on we were brought in kind of midway, a year and a half into a Workday implementation. One of the big consulting firms was hired to help a company transition from SAP to Workday, and there were 11 teams working on this project. And what was happening was each of the developer teams was working pretty well, but the spaces in between information was kind of turning from red in a dashboard, a stoplight thing, from red to yellow to green by the time it got up to the governance committee. And so there was an issue around safety between the teams and about passing bad news up the chain. But what became really clear, there were co-team leads, an IT leader and a functional leader on each of the developer teams. And we got them all in a room one day in Europe. And it was really powerful. And it kind of connects to the first two elements in your model around clarity. And I think the second one is, I don't know if engagement is the second one.
Yeah, opening up engagement. That's right.
Opening up engagement. And it was really clear. What was really interesting is they were a year and a half into this project. And, there wasn't safety between them because they really hadn't got together to really craft some shared purpose together. But, they weren't actually bought into the whole change to begin with. And so the leaders really were just having a hard time selling the whole change effort a year and a half into all the developers are working really hard on the project. So it's kind of interesting when you think about just the way we set projects up, about how we generate buy-in, set expectations, set the conditions and the groundwork for the kind of level of clarity and safety that people need to actually get off to a good start. And so I do think there's, again, because I'm the structure guy, I go back to, can we design in accountability in the beginning in the way we work and in the culture of even just a, change management exercise that may go on for a year or 2 or 3 years, right?
That's right. I think that's really well taken, Krister. I think that, we put clarity and safety and, engagement up front on purpose, because when we do those things well, it makes so much of what comes after, better. It doesn't mean you're not going to run into moments where, there's lack of clarity, or things are people are, getting a little bit misaligned. So, we have some practices in there that help us address that. But to the extent that we spend more time up front, one big takeaway that I find a lot of people, take from, when we're talking about accountability is like, I actually need to sort of spend more time on making sure clarity is happening, that it's negotiated, that it's mutual, that people are really on board and understand their roles and responsibilities, and that they feel comfortable being themselves and that they're engaged. So when we do that well, it makes things go a lot smoother from there on out, for sure.
I'm curious, you mentioned that you, in the consulting world, yourself and your colleagues have started to do more work with, CEOs and their teams. And one of the issues that I'm seeing is that the nature of the problems, which in some cases are a little bit more intractable in terms of the type of work that senior leadership teams are doing, that it is more difficult for that practice of clarity, and then that whole tension comes in of providing as much clarity as you can and helping people navigate an awful lot of unknowns and ambiguity and that kind of thing. And can you say a little bit more around your practices of working with CEOs and those kind of level teams around the practice of clarity?
Yeah, absolutely. So in thinking about, getting clarity, one of the things that we've helped a couple of CEOs do is reimagine their teams after they've received, private equity investment. It's sort of a moment where now there's this big opportunity to grow. And so how do we do that kind of consciously? How do we do that in a way that, is really kind of smart and scalable? And so I think that in some ways is an exercise in clarity, because it involves, number one, being clear on, what are our goals really. So being clear on strategy and figuring out kind of where you're headed. And then, one of the things that, we do when we work with teams is kind of clarify the purpose of the executive leadership team. And so that's another important exercise in clarity, is understanding what is the purpose of that team. And then that in turn helps us further clarify who needs to be on the team and what's kind of skills and backgrounds and, what kind of diversity do we need on that team in order for it to be, a really effective team in the long run. So doing, so some of the clarity really begins with that kind of, the CEO kind of examining both, where is the organization really headed? And so that work can be done obviously in collaboration with other partners like the board or, investors or other folks. But then, getting clear with the team about what the purpose is and therefore, who should be on the team going forward? Who does that team really need? And sometimes, who needs to come off of the team? And it doesn't mean they leave the organization. It just may mean that they don't necessarily need to be on that top enterprise leadership team. And that's often a difficult conversation or difficult thing to do, and needs to be done, carefully and with sensitivity towards people who really derive kind of a positive benefit in terms of their own sense of their place in the organization and their relationship to the CEO. So that's can be challenging, but it's often what needs to happen in order to right size that team. I don't know if you've had experiences like that as well.
Absolutely. And the impact of where that person goes, because there's a feeling then that, well, what do my direct reports think of me now that I'm no longer part of that senior leadership team? Or what does the rest of the organization, what's the narrative that's building? So there's an awful lot of self-doubt and questioning that kind of creeps in. And I think sometimes horribly in the absence of the clarity that you just described, right? So the kind of decision is made, the person is informed, but there isn't that clarity around, well, how have we actually got to that place, which I think for me really speaks to one of my fundamental principles around accountability, is that I expect to engage in adult to adult relationships, with in all walks of life, right? In the workplace, in who I report to and who reports to me, who I'm members of team with, so on and so forth. So I don't know if you've had experience of that, where the absence of the individual not even knowing, well, what's going on here? What's behind this decision? And quite damaging then not just for the individual involved, but for the wider team, because it starts to create doubt. Could I potentially be next, or what that might mean?
No, I absolutely agree. I've seen certain teams and companies in there going through such like kind of like rocket ship speed growth that they drop or forget to do these things that are very important in terms of keeping people kind of more engaged. And a simple thing is just explaining the why, which is what you're pointing to here. Explaining why decisions are happening and why they make sense and why they line up with the sort of where the organization is headed, and just with just a little bit of information, people can then understand. And it also means that you are creating the narrative rather than responding to the narrative that gets created in the absence of doing that. And to your point, it doesn't just affect the individual; it starts to create all sorts of story in the organization that doesn't necessarily serve the culture.
And in often cases has that negative impact on the culture. I'm hearing that Zippy agrees with us there, Krister, which is
on cue.
Zippy had to chime right in.
Yeah. You might see him wandering around back there. He's on Sentinel, right? There's something about monitoring mechanisms and being on alert, right?
That's right.
You mentioned that piece as well about doing culture work, which I guess is where this kind of conversation is going into, the impact of accountability and in creating the wider culture that we want to create. Could you say a bit more about some of the projects where you're working, where you're starting at that level of culture as opposed to, with an individual leader or with a team?
Yeah. So we recently worked with an organization that, again, private equity backed, that was positioned for, again, really major growth. And they had what they experienced as a really, positive culture, a culture of care, a culture of respect. And they were concerned that how do we retain the best of our culture through this period of growth, knowing that things are going to have to change, that they're going to have to probably become more bureaucratic than they were. There's going to be, more, more teams that are working, in different places. And so how do we kind of create, maintain our culture while actually also changing certain aspects of the way we work? So we did a kind of a culture assessment of kind of where their culture is today, where they would like it to go, and then what are the sort of strategies or ideas that people had about what it would take to move the culture in the desired direction. And it was a really fun. At least we engaged, we experienced it as a fun exercise to kind of really get a pulse on this organization, and hear from lots of different people in different parts. When you work with a system, it's kind of like the blind man and the elephant. Everybody has like a different part of it, and so experiences a bit differently. But they were able to identify a handful of areas that they wanted to look at and kind of rethink, and it really led to importantly a refresh of their values, and the values, they had a number of values. Maybe there were 7 that previously. And it was so many that it was too many for people to really remember, and they felt like it was just time for a new set of values that really resonated. So they did a lot of work, kind of talking about and thinking about what are their values now, and came up with 3 that were really quite compelling and spoke to their identity of who they are, but also how they want to evolve consciously towards an effective and connected organization. And so again, we tried to really help them elevate their awareness on kind of where they're actually at and what's desirable in moving forward, and then help them kind of craft a plan towards making headway on a number of specific initiatives that would move them in the direction that they wanted to go.
And I don't know where you are in that project, but are there any kind of outcomes or things that you experienced as shifting in the system for that particular organization?
You know, it may still be a little early to tell. One of the things, though, I mean, we've gotten quite a lot of engagement at different levels of the organization in terms of people wanting to be in these conversations that are helping to make a difference. And I think that's important because a lot of times in organizational life, people perceive things as happening in a very top-down way.
Yes.
You know, policies and procedures and changes just come down, and they have no idea who made the decision, why it's happening. You know, in this, we try to create visible opportunities. Like, if this is something that matters to you, please join us, get involved on this, you know, this focus group, or come and share your ideas, and let's craft this solution together. Really trying to co-create. And I think that, you know, by itself is inviting a different kind of energy and transparency into the process. So and that's, you know, part of the change that they were wanting to make, is to kind of really create, you know, super transparent organization. So people, so it promotes trust, right? Where there's transparency, there's greater trust. And sort of, they really recognize that ultimately they were in the trust business, whether it was with their clients and their customers, or with internally. And so you know, those were some, at least from a process standpoint, some of the things I can point to. And the story's still unfolding. So maybe next time I come back, I can tell you more.
That's fabulous, because I loved what you're saying there, because sometimes, you know, the work that we do, you know, it's powerful in itself to even help an organization and step back and go, is our culture and our values fit for purpose in terms of where we are and where we want to go?
That's right.
And that might result in refining, as it did in the example that you described, or it might result in a revalidation of, no, these values are fit for purpose, but some of our practices around these values are letting us down, and that's what we need to focus on and reestablish. Lovely. Christopher, anything in the chat box that you want to draw to our attention and share?
There is actually, you know, what I've been musing on now the last couple of minutes is David and I have, over the last couple of years, worked on a couple of projects, and one of them was a private equity backed case that he alluded to, where there was, you know, something like a dozen plus teams that were being assessed around team effectiveness and CEO effectiveness in the portfolio. And following that, we now have been kind of doing some work and trying to bring some offerings, not just post investment around developing teams, but also pre-investment around startups and due diligence. And we'll probably be having a session on startups in the future, so I won't steal the thunder from that learning conversation. But one of the things that's coming up for me is I've had the good fortune over my career to work in lots of different kinds of organizations. So I spent a lot of years in international organizations. I've worked with nonprofits, foundations, higher ed. I've worked with a lot of corporations, and then, you know, private equity and venture capital backed companies. And just around this whole theme of this intersection between leadership, accountability, and team effectiveness and coaching, one of the things I'm really struck by is the venture capital and private equity space, I would think, probably fosters the most accountability of all the types of industries I've been in. And I think a lot of it has to do, with the financial investments that are made, but a lot of times, you know, they don't pussyfoot around, especially with composition, which is a big one. So they really kind of want to make sure they have the right people in the right roles and they're not afraid to kind of pull somebody out of a role, I think that David alluded to. So I think that in and of itself mops up a lot of things that act on drags and systems in an organization, especially when there are senior people in senior positions. Obviously the results orientation, the desire to generate results and get a return on investment, is another element. And, and that can maybe be a risk when there's so much focused on accelerating results and growth. But I do think there's some healthy thing there. I've seen the inverse of that in other organizations where profit and ROI isn't really the currency. It's not the metric.
Right.
And there's a culture of people being in an organization for long periods of time. There's a bottleneck in the senior positions, and there's just a lot, and it breeds. And, when I would do these like team surveys every year, accountability would come up, transparency and accountability would come up year after year after year. It's just like endemic in the culture as things that people were craving for. So I like where the conversation was going, just around culture and what kind of, what kind of sector and industry are we in? How does that actually show up in consciously or unconsciously in how we actually are, how culture is manifesting in our company or organization? And then, what are the kinds of different levers we can make as team coaches or those leading teams to shape that culture a little bit more deliberately? I'm reminded of Richard Hackman, who spoke about the 3 ways norms get established in teams. So norms are the practices and behaviors, really the culture of the team. And the first was, he said, we import norms from being in different organizations on teams. So we have learned to do things in certain ways, and then we just go join teams and we bring those norms with us. Another way is that they just kind of emerge organically, that as a result of working together, stuff gets tinkered with and norms emerge. But the more rare type, but one of the most effective, is actually to deliberately design norms. But it's not something that most teams and team leaders, again, like the VC and the PE folks, they think team effectiveness is about composition. Right. And while the composition of the team is really important, it's just one element. And I think in that case we worked on, David, we found that a lot of the top teams, we had to help them decouple the organization's purpose from the leadership team's purpose at that stage in the life of the business. That was kind of a big theme for them. Like, isn't it the same when you ask them what's the leadership team's purpose? You would get statements of the organization's purpose.
That's right.
And not the leadership team's purpose. Yeah. So I think that was a big one. We also found that a lot of them tended to lead through one-on-one management styles. And what that did was foster accountability one-on-one, but that doesn't foster enterprise ownership and thinking. It fosters more siloed excellence. And then when the leaders were having troubles with each other, they didn't have the relationships to go to each other. So a lot of the CEOs are really interested in what does it mean to shift from leading through one-on-one to actually coaching my team as a collective?
That's right.
And that one really peaked. I know, David, you were actually in Florida with a group of the CEOs having a half-day session with them, sharing insights from the assessments we had done with them. But I don't know if there's anything there to add on to.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, double click on what you said there around, a lot of CEOs don't appreciate, they think about, managing their directs, but they don't think about their role as a coach in actually working with this team and getting the team, to function together in a stronger way. Sometimes I think even if CEOs recognize that that's something that they should be doing or ought to be doing, they may be flummoxed by how to do that, especially when they begin running into challenges with either dynamics or challenges where people are in conflict with one another. They think, I don't want to be bothered with this. This is like, can someone else please clean this up for me? As opposed to kind of recognizing, okay, let's look at what's going on in this team. Let's really think about how are we set up here? How can we set the team up so we can all focus on our common goal and we can really think about what it means to win together. And then kind of working with the team as a unit towards that. I think there's a lot that we can continue to do to help leaders take that on as an important aspect of their role.
And there's an absence of awareness there around by continuing the one-to-one dynamic that you're essentially letting your team members off the hook and allowing them to have that door around, well, this isn't working for me with that area over there, as opposed to helping them and coaching them to be able to have those conversations with each other and hold each other to account. And I was working with a team recently whereby one of the leaders was levied with holding everybody else to account in a founder team, and I was curious about that. Was probably what that organization needed to get them to that point in time, because I'm a big believer in whatever is kind of, you know, cooking usually gets an organization to where it is to that point in time, but it probably won't sustain them into the next evolution of where it is that they need to go, where there probably needs to be more shared leader across the founder team, as opposed to potentially leaving it to one leader to hold everybody else in the organization to account. I don't know if you have thoughts around that, either of you, around this whole idea of, you know, the arcs in an organization and what might have got us here is not necessarily going to get us there. And a big part of our job as coaches is helping teams step back and see, you know, not just the gap as in, you know, everything that's wrong, but actually celebrating everything that got the organization to that point in time before they look to move on and create the next part of, or the next few chapters of the organization's history.
Yeah, Melissa, I totally agree with your philosophy of what Marshall Goldsmith called, you know, in the famous book, you know, what got you here won't get you there.
Get you there, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's you know, often the case. And even though and there's strengths that allow them, you know, they're on one hand there's strengths, but they may begin to work at, you know, as you know, weaknesses or drawbacks in another sort of situation as things kind of evolve. And so. And I really also just like what you said, because I would completely agree. I've seen this same challenge for people to stop, for the team members to stop looking to the CEO for the solution. And they need to begin looking within themselves and with each other in co-creating, you know, solutions to the challenges. And
what is my role here? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Rather than waiting for the CEO to like come in and tell them or solve it, like getting more active and engaged in exerting their leadership within the team, but not in a top-down way. I mean, I think people often mistake leadership as just being top-down.
Yeah.
I want to come back to this. I think we've had some good comments going on in the chat, but we had a question here from Gabe David around how resistance to conscious accountability presents itself to your clients and how you help address it.
Great question, Gabe. Thanks for putting that there. I mean, one of the things that people, that some CEOs or some people I've heard have said is, or concern raised is, it seems like this is going to take a lot of time. You know, like it seems like all of these conversations and whatever, like, is just going to slow us down, and we're going to be, paralyzed by these conversations, and we're not going to move forward, and we're not going to move fast enough. So, so that's sometimes a concern that gets raised. But, you know, what I often say, or to address that, or to, is to say it seems like it's less efficient, but it's only less efficient in the short run. In the long run, it's actually much more efficient for the reasons that we've discussed. That if you, unless you lay the groundwork properly, on the front end, and really have conversations in which you get to clarity, you get to buy-in, you create that safety, and have whatever hard conversations are needed sort of upfront, as many of them as you need to have in order to get there or get close, then you're going to pay for it later when things derail, when there's these situations that, because you didn't lay the groundwork, things kind of did not go to plan, and then you end up spending more time and more resources figuring out how to, mitigate that. And if that involves like replacing team members, which it often may, that is also very costly and time consuming, right? So that's one of the resistances, but also one of the things that you can kind of help people see is like we're looking. Conscious accountability is about playing the long game. It's not transactional accountability. But it's something that can be transformational because it can up-level both relationships and create kind of a virtuous cycle of learning within the team.
Say a bit more about that. I know you talk about it in the book, but transactional accountability and transformational accountability. Tell us a little bit more about those concepts.
So like, when accountability is transactional, it's often like, if I did my part, I checked the box and I was accountable, and that's all I need to think about. And then, anyone else's like accountabilities are really up to them. And so that's sort of one aspect of the sort of transactional nature. People just sort of not looking at the big picture and not looking at not just what was on my list or what do I need to do, but like, how are we doing, and having eyes open towards our teammates and others around us, and being able to kind of jump in, offer support, offer whatever is needed in some ways to help get the job done together. That's a much different spirit when a team says, I'm going to do anything to have us win and to have us get to where we need to go, versus teams that say, oh, that's not in my job description. That's for someone else to do. Now, obviously it's important that everybody knows their roles and responsibilities and have an enterprise-wide perspective on what we're trying to do together. So that's one aspect of that. The other is, again, this idea of looking at just results in terms of our focus of accountability versus results and relationships. When we expand there, we're not just sort of like focusing on, did we get this thing done? But we ask, like, how did we get it done? Did we get it done in a way that makes people want to work together more? To go again. Exactly. Versus like, that was terrible. I don't want to, like, we got it done, but I'd rather not do that again. Thank you very much. So by paying attention to both, we can really play that long game together and not get stuck on a shorter term transactional kind of game instead.
So I've been teaching on MBA programs for 12 years, all around the area of team dynamics, improving team performance. The program I teach on at Trinity College Dublin is a team-based MBA. So your outcome is dependent. There's a real interdependency there. But from years of experience, and I'll probably have a lot of alumni sending me angry emails, but from years of experience, that transactional piece is in play a lot. It's like, well, I did my bit, you didn't do your bit, and let's get into a standoff over the fact that I'm able to tick my box and you're not able to tick your box. And then all the things that you described, people just figure out strategies to work around the dynamic rather than deal with the dynamic. And in a lot of ways, I get it, because the undertaking of an MBA, it's a big undertaking at a big personal cost. And a lot of what's really happening is, the tiredness that sets in with that, or there are a myriad of different reasons. But I do think it's reflective of the world that we live in today, especially as we all find ourselves, on multiple different teams with multiple different stakeholders. And I'm curious, did your book touch on that at all, where, with so many priorities, with so many different things to hold, and kind of human infallibility comes into play?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the, one of the practices is nailing it, which is like doing what you say you'll do. And so, and one of the things that, we understand is that, we live in a world where there's so many competing commitments that people have, that get in the way. And so, I think it's, number one, like prioritization is really important part of this, like really in order to kind of figure out what are the things we really want to do well. Being clear on our own priorities and our own boundaries is super important. And and also, I mean, I also, again, one of the things that I'm paying a lot more attention to, and again, this is also in my role in teaching MBA and other master's level students, is this, there's a lot of, of mental health kinds of issues happening, a lot of stress happening, people, talking more freely about the fact that they've been depressed. And so, I think that, again, our evolving perspective on work also has to account for well-being of all the individuals as an important part of sustainability, like personal sustainability and team sustainability. Relies on kind of, again, being aware of each of ourselves and each other in that domain, and being like, Allison had a number of comments in the chat about empathy and the and the vital importance of empathy, and I think that this comes into play in thinking about teams. And I've seen it with some of my students where they recognize somebody had a really tough week. They had an interview and it went terribly, and so we're going to step in and take their part of what they had to do and care for them in that way. And I love it when I hear stories like that, because that's the kind of accountability that I hope we can build more collectively. One that isn't just, well, we said on the charter that this is what you were going to do, so either you did it or you didn't,
or you didn't,
and that's on you. But more of this sort of space where we can hold each other, because life is, stuff happens.
Messy.
It's messy. And so how can we hold each other better in the mess and still get to the goal line as best we can?
Yeah. I know that you do a lot of, sorry, go on ahead, Krister. Well, I know you do a lot of work around team emotional intelligence. I'm just, that kind of sounds to me as if that feeds into the conversations you're having with your students as well, around the need for team emotional intelligence, which is very different to our individual intelligence. And then I will emotionally intelligently pass back to Krister after this last one question here.
Yes, indeed. I think helping teams develop team emotional intelligence skills is part of what I do with students, as well as on the teams that I'm coaching, and just to even give them the awareness that there is this other kind of emotional intelligence that exists at the team level, in terms of the norms that the teams develop. And to your point earlier, Krister, about I think that's one of the things that I like to try to do with the teams, again, whether they're at the student teams at Yale or the ones I'm coaching outside in the world, about being very intentional about the norms that they're creating. Allow them to be conscious and sort of say, okay, what kind of norms will actually serve us as we work together towards the plan that we have? And unfortunately, I don't think a lot of teams, they just get the strategic plan and they say, okay, ready, go. And they start executing without that sort of like, well, how are we going to do the dance together? How do we want to do that? So anyway, there's a lot of things that I think that the kinds of stuff that we do can make a difference for teams and what it feels like to be a part of them.
Yeah. I was going to say, we're coming up on the hour mark, and there's nothing sacrosanct about that. We can, go over that just to highlight the time we've been burning here. And, one of our norms when the three of us got on today, we designed how we wanted to roll with this conversation, and that there wasn't really a formal structure. We agreed that I would kind of just take a look at kind of the flow as it was unfolding, but we would just get into it and allow the conversation to emerge. And I love where this has taken us. This wasn't scripted or outlined, but I thought there's some, really insightful comments in the chat, and just wanted to highlight those and see if you guys have any comments on these. But this one I thought by Margaret was really powerful. She said, many organizations forget that the environment they are operating in is changing quickly and structurally. The leadership teams rarely view their accountability to adjust their structure and team for the elements that will allow them to absorb and adjust to the changes. They are operating in a broader environment. It is strategically very dangerous to have a rigid leadership structure in environments like this. It's akin to taking an army tank to a street fight. I thought that was a pretty powerful comment. Yeah. Melissa, is it triggering something in you, or
Well, it really resonates, doesn't it, insofar as, I think it goes back to that intentionality that David is talking about, where, there was a team that I was working with, and part of the work that we did was interview the team members at the start of the intervention, and then interview their identified stakeholders at the start of the intervention. And then we did some coaching work, and then we invited the stakeholders back as part of a focus group. And the most interesting thing happened when the group of stakeholders came in to do a focus group to share their thoughts and perspectives as to, what had shifted in the team or what they were noticing about the team. They start shaking hands with each other. And it was the first time that they'd physically been in a room together, because they were from such a big organization that they were in different physical buildings, different physical environments. And they had this really powerful conversation where they said, wow, we're accountable here. We've never sat down and discussed, how we are prioritizing this team, how we're sharing our shared expectations of this team. Essentially, what we're doing is I'm drumming through my priorities, you're drumming through your priorities,
right? And
they just have to try and make sense of that. And no wonder they're not meeting anybody's expectations, because there's no kind of clarity there around that. So I just thought it was myself and my team coach, we just kind of looked at each other with this kind of wow recognition in our eyes of the stakeholders introducing themselves to each other for the first time, but putting all of these demands on the team. I don't know if that resonates with either of you.
Oh, absolutely. I coached a team that kind of got together for the first time shortly. They started during the pandemic and had never been co-located. And so I think, Zoom is great, but it has limitations. And so getting people together in a room where they actually are experiencing each other in a more kind of real, full, more embodied way, I think ups the accountability, sense of accountability to one another, because this is a real person that I'm more connected to now. And therefore I have a greater sense of accountability than I did previously, where it's somehow easier to discount that, the less you really know a person, sometimes it's easier to not be as accountable to them. So I absolutely resonate with that story. Great story, Melissa.
I think this is echoing in the comments. Lauren says, I love this conversation, but executive teams are struggling, and they are so focused on operational that they're making decisions in the dad model. Decide, act, defend. Be careful. I'm a dad here, so gotta be nice to the dad. Just kidding. But totally agree. I think one of the things we find is that most executive teams are not teams. They're groups, teams in name only. So the level of interdependence isn't there. And so I think that's one of the big things we can really do is try to help them have the spaces where they actually can become more than just the sum of the parts if they need to be. And more, it almost feels like every organization I work, there is a need for the executive team to be more than just great individual silo leaders that meet together periodically to update. So I think that's a big one. I was just working with the team, 2 weeks ago, and we were doing some purpose work for their leadership team. Again, decoupling the leadership team's purpose from the organization's purpose. And they were struggling a little bit with the time frame, because I was saying, why don't you guys think 3 to 6 months? And they said, oh, no, but the purpose really should be like a year or 2 or 3 years. I said, well, I think the world is so dynamic. I don't know if you could have a purpose that, in terms of what the unique contribution of the leadership team is, my guess in most cases, what it's going to need to be now is a little bit different than 6 months from now. Mm-hmm. And so there is something about moving from that 30,000 foot level to thinking about who are our most critical stakeholders in the next few months, 6 months, and what is the unique contribution that we as an executive team can make to most shift this organization and its culture to help us, move down that road. And I'm finding that's helping them to get a little bit more of a fire under their tail around what are they actually doing together that's adding real value. We have data over and over again seeing that the majority of leadership teams spend a lot of time doing updates, and they don't do updates terribly well either. Right. I had one story of a top team in the banking sector where they're like, hey, 15 people on the team, so already massively bloated. Everybody was supposed to get 7 minutes. I just went in to observe one of their sessions, not intervening or anything. And everybody was supposed to have 7 minutes. It actually took 45 minutes to get through the first 3. So instead of 21 minutes, it was 45.
Oh my gosh.
And then what I noticed was I was just jotting down behaviors. I have like an observation checklist. And 45 minutes in, the phones started coming out. People were scanning their phones. Some people got up to go to the bathroom to get a cup of coffee. So people's attention could only last 45 minutes. So this was like a golden opportunity, because now I could actually coach them and say, how would you guys like to find a way to doing updates that doesn't blow your whole meeting, and where unless you're the first 3 people, you're not going to get any good consultation and feedback from your colleagues, right? So, but yeah, I totally concur with the comment that, executive teams are overwhelmed by operational. It's a tough time to be a leader. So a lot of empathy for individual, but, collective leadership teams as well. But, honestly, this is also a little bit of the price of leadership. And, many of you probably have heard me say, leadership is the most studied social science topic in terms of research, books. I mean, MBA programs, executive ed, it's like a topic we just pour incredible amounts of money into. The leadership, the learning and development industry overwhelmingly puts most of its money into leadership development. And we're just really struggling, around, we have a lot of leaders, but very little leadership. And I know, Melissa, we have done some work around seeing that team coaching is wonderful by external or internal team coaches, but we really need to equip leaders and teams themselves much more to be able to create environments that lead to the outcomes and the accountability and all that they're seeking. So I think that's an area where we really need to elevate. Now, you guys are really well positioned because you're training next generation leaders in these universities, which I think is wonderful, right? Because they're going to go inhabit leadership roles in organizations. So I think that's a promising area, is really looking at the next generation. But honestly, organization leaders aren't just struggling. Our political leaders are flailing something miserably. And I think the pandemic really exposed kind of the state of national governance and international relations. I mean, I did a lot of work at the United Nations for over a decade, and we have a lot of serious challenges on the global scene, and there's never been a more important time for us to move away from the heroic individual leader to really good collaborative leadership. And for whatever reason, we're just stuck in the mythology of the savior complex of hoping a leader is going to come along and save us. And great individual transformative leaders do come along, but that's usually because there are conditions that are ripe for a movement that gets sparked and codified in an individual. But yeah, I do think collective leadership is still really in its infancy. But the challenges of our time really are demanding a step change. And I think this is a beautiful space we get to play in. I mean, I feel so honored. I don't know if you guys feel this, but we get to go into the DNA of companies and organizations at the core of the top team and help the group of people who can most shift the organization culture, impact their stakeholders, including their employees and the like. And I think that's just incredible privilege to be in those spaces.
Agree.
It absolutely is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go on, David. Go ahead.
No. Just agree. And you know, I also find, you mentioned earlier that you know, Melissa and I get to do this work with emerging leaders and in terms of the next generation, and I also feel like that's a privilege as well. To be able, one of the things that happens sometimes when I'm, you know, working with a course around teaching them how they can be more effective as team members, not just team leaders. When I hear, I took what I learned in your class and I took it over to this other project that I'm on in this other team, and it's actually working. Like that to me is gold. Like, yes, you've got skills that are now transferable to whatever team that you happen to be on. And that, you know, that will serve you hopefully for your whole career. So, and you know, again, hopefully giving people skills that help them also to adapt as well. You know, and to be agile, because conditions will always change. The teams that they're on will change, but if they can have skills that they can bring, even, you know, to learn how to learn under changing conditions, then we've really, you know, made an impact.
Made an impact.
Yeah.
I like what you both are saying there. I do believe it's a privilege, and my feeling on it is, and with that privilege comes responsibility, and how we hold ourselves accountable in our work is super important. Our intentionality in terms of how we show up. And, you know, I typically work in pairs when I team coach, and how we role model accountability in our pairing, I believe is a super important part of the work that we do. And I just recognize what you're saying, Krista, around that whole, you know, what I call the look up model, look up to the great person model, is completely defunct. And we as humans absolutely probably know that at a cognitive level, but I feel that we still struggle to create the conditions, not just in organizations, but the world over,
absolutely,
to open up. You know, if politics is failing, that's reflective of society.
Absolutely.
If healthcare environments are failing, that's reflective of society. And I just often feel that we, absolutely. I just often feel that we kind of push that over to, rubbish politicians.
Well, actually, I'll put up a quote here that I was going to save to the end. It doesn't look like it'll all fit on one quote, but I'll read this. But this comes from Lao Tzu, and he said, "When virtue is lost, benevolence appears. When benevolence is lost, right conduct appears. When right conduct is lost, expedience appears. Expediency is the mere shadow of right and truth. It is the beginning of disorder." And I think kind of what that gets at for me is just the nested systems of the individual, the pair relationship, the family, the community, the organization, the nation, and, you know, the international kind of relationships, you know. And, you know, I do think there is something around, just the interplay of this. And I think this is a great question from Allison around, you know, how do we have a culture of teamsmanship and trust in a larger context of polarization, in a larger context of national, you know, brewing national conflict, right? Where trust in the country is frayed. And I do think there is something around the times we're living in. And part of the reason why we're here having this learning conversation live is that, you know, we are living in an era where technology, I don't know if you guys have been following the Chat GBT, the artificial intelligence, but like, its acceleration to 1 million users was the fastest of any technology. It happened in like days, whereas other technologies like Google and Twitter and all these things, you know, take a lot longer. But we're living in an age of exponential technologies, communication technologies. And, you know, a lot of media oftentimes is like, you go through Twitter, it's like it's called doom scrolling, right? You just scroll through and it's like for every positive quote or article, there's like 10 or 50 negative. And I think one of the things we all can do is really start to take up our voices, citizen journalism, putting out positive messages. I think we need a lot more role modeling and stories of the good things people are doing, because they're always buried. We don't hear the stories of the leadership team or the two leaders that teamed up to do something, you know, meaningful, serving a larger constituency. And, you know, so one simple thing, I think, Allison, you know, just the organizations I'm working in, not taking on national conflict now at this point, but like one of the leadership teams I work with, I oftentimes say to leadership teams, you guys are such a black box to your employees and all your stakeholders, because they don't have any insight into what you're doing. And the team itself is just scrambling to get its act together. So they're not even able yet to focus on their stakeholders. But one of the things we start planting early seeds around is get yourselves together, start acting and taking actions. And then in a month or two, let's start getting you more visible in your ecosystem so people can start seeing you as a collective, seeing what you're doing, even maybe finding a way to make visible and transparent the actual board of work that you're working on, and holding the spaces to be really transparent and foster that, you know, demonstrate good collective leadership that's visible. So anyways, that's just a very simple one. I know it doesn't really get at this broader national conflict, but in some ways it's only when there's crisis and challenge is when leadership actually has the opportunity to be exercised, right? It's when there's a gap is when leadership actually can be exerted. So in some ways, it's a wicked opportunity when there's national conflict or there's conflict for leaders to show up and really model, you know, something really positive. Anyways, that's a little monologue and diatribe there, but yeah.
It is, but it just goes to show the benefit of having these learning conversations and allowing ourselves to be unfiltered and take the conversation where the conversation goes, and maybe representative of the fact that, you know, the three of us know each other and have experience of working with each other. But I really enjoyed this conversation and the willingness just to allow it to go where it went. But just in terms of holding ourselves accountable and maybe certainly David's time, I'm sure you have other things in your day. Just to close us out, anything that you'd want to share with us, David, in terms of, you know, your kind of key thing that you're focusing on in your own work that's making you more intentional, more accountable in the work that you do?
Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is like it's sort of the consciousness part of conscious accountability, and how do we become more consciously aware? I think, you know, that is a lifelong project, but I've been really taking up, you know, thinking about how I can practice mindfulness and build muscle around that, because I believe that when we become more aware of our own state of mind, and kind of who's driving the bus up here. Are we coming from ego, insecurity, fear? Or are we coming from creation and the intention of the thing that we want to create in the world? So, so I think, you know, one of the things that I'm interested in thinking about with leaders is how do we help create leaders who have practices that support greater conscious awareness? Because I believe with that comes choice. And when we can act from choice as opposed to being driven by some other force that may be less in our awareness, we can have more. We can have more the results that we really want to achieve, both for kind of our goals as well as the people around us that we want to kind of support and you know, and improve. So that's some of, you know, where I'm at right now, is thinking about how do I and how do we become more how do we make sure we can step back a little bit and create the space for that awareness to be there. But I want to thank you both. It's been such a wonderful conversation, being here with you. And so,
for the weekend, David, thank you so much for your generosity.
You so
and
much.
We know we pulled you over time, so feel free to pop off and we'll be having you back for sure. So have a great weekend, David, and well done today. Really stimulating conversations.
Yeah, same here. And thanks to everybody who is tuning in.
Yeah.
Really great questions and engagement from the folks who jumped on it to be with us. So
great.
So take care, and we'll be back again in the team coaching zone, hopefully before too long.
Awesome.
Lovely.
David, there's a nice quote here,
care.
somebody owing you something. But Melissa, why don't you stay on for a moment? We can kind of tee up the what's
Next
coming
one.
up in the future episodes for the listeners here before we wrap up today's conversation. But anything in conclusion you're kind of taking away, Melissa, from this? It's got me inspired for the weekend. And as part of our going back and forth was we were wondering whether Fridays would be a good day to do this. And I'm actually glad we picked Friday, because I think it's a great way to kind of wrap up the week and get into a good place and be in that reflection space. Yeah.
And turn up with intentionality as opposed to, the crunch that some of the other days in the week can bring. The key thing for me, Krister, is just when you speak with somebody like David, who turns up with that level of humanity, it gives me hope again. So that's kind of I know we covered so much ground, but that's kind of the thing that's sitting with me.
Yeah. I'm lucky because David and I just, after the first podcast I did with him 8 years, we've had a chance to work on some projects, and a long running one where we actually meet once a week for an hour.
That's right.
With some other colleagues around at startups and venture capital space. He's just a good person to be around, and I think there's this saying that you are the sum of the 5 or 6 people you most spend time around. So I think it's always good to surround yourself with solid people. And I feel the same way about you, Melissa. So I'm happy to spend time today with 2 really solid people and some really wonderful people in the audience. I hadn't recognized some of the names in the chat. So that was great.
Insights, great questions, great reflections.
Really love that.
Thoroughly
so Melissa,
enjoyable.
why don't you tee up what's coming up next episode, and then I can share a bit about the one after that.
So next episode, and you've caught me on the hop here, you're going to have to remind
Fox.
me.
Yep.
Is Sebastian next?
Yep.
I thought he was the week after. My apologies.
So we have... Actually, no, you're right. I got it backwards. So next week, March 10th, we're going to be having 3 internal team coaching practitioners and leaders. Internal in 3 different companies, 2 tech companies and a biotech company are going to be coming on to talk a little bit about internal team coaching. So what it's like to stand up,
about this conversation.
Internal team coaching, what it's like doing this work internally. So that'll be a great conversation. So that'll be their first time speaking together. But Melissa and I know each one of us knows at least one of the people on the of the guests coming. So I think that's going to be an interesting one. And what about the week after that is the Sebastian Fox one?
The week after, we have Sebastian Fox, who's a team coach, and he wrote a paper. We'll share a link to the paper at the time, but it's this whole idea of presence in team coaching. And he interviewed about 6 or 7 coaches, can't remember the exact number. He named the team coaches that he named. Okay. A number of them are folks that you and I know, have worked with, have read their books, thought leaders in the space around this whole idea of presence in team coaching and the impacts that creates. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation, just for him to share the insights around it and how he went about that research, but then more broadly, the work that he's doing with teams and teams that he's a part of. So that's what we have for the week after. Yeah. Nice.
The interviews are booking up quite a bit. And so we're really excited about that. And would love your guys' comments. I just stuck in the chats, both in YouTube and in LinkedIn, We have the LinkedIn, the team coaching learning community group there on LinkedIn. You can check that out. We put out a poll last week, not a poll, just a query around what topics people are interested in. So feel free to go over there and keep the conversation going. And we will be posting this episode. You can always go to YouTube and LinkedIn and find it and watch, but we'll also be putting it up into the Team Coaching Zone portal and different places. So feel free to come back and look at this. I know this time doesn't work for everybody, so we have quite a bit of asynchronous learners tuning in, and we'll also be having it going out later today or tomorrow on the various podcasting channels. So
that's right.
Yeah, so great, everybody. Yeah.
Feel free to wear pink next Friday, Krister Lowe.
All right.
And
we'll see what I can do. I got to dig deep. I don't know if I got anything in my wardrobe, but I'll have to hustle something together.
Looking forward to that. Have a great weekend. Happy Friday, everybody, and look forward to the conversation next week.
Okay. All right, everybody. Take care. Bye now.